November 1917, Passchendaele, Belgium. The telegram arrived at German High Command headquarters just after dawn, and the words confirmed their worst nightmare. Canadian Corps had done the impossible. They had broken through the mud-soaked defenses that held against British and French forces for 3 brutal months. The Canadians swept through positions that cost the British 60,000 casualties to barely dent. They did it in less than 2 weeks. German General Erich Ludendorff sat at his desk, reading intelligence reports that painted a terrifying picture. These Canadians fought differently than any Allied force his armies had faced. They moved through trenches like hunters, using grenades and close-quarters weapons with deadly skill. They planned their attacks with scientific precision, then executed them with savage efficiency. British soldiers followed orders. French soldiers fought with passion, but Canadians fought with something else entirely, a cold, methodical brutality that left German defenders dead before they understood what hit them. By late 1917, the numbers told a grim story. Over 47,000 German soldiers had fallen into Canadian hands. That was more prisoners than entire divisions contained. Intelligence officers compiled reports from survivors who escaped Canadian captivity through prisoner exchanges. The stories matched. Canadians showed no mercy on the battlefield. They cleared trenches with ruthless speed. They took few prisoners during actual fighting because they simply killed everything in their path. German military leadership circulated official warnings to all units facing Canadian Corps. The memo called them Huns in khaki, a bitter twist on Allied propaganda that called Germans barbaric Huns. The irony stung. Germany's own soldiers now faced an enemy that fought with even greater cruelty, yet claimed to represent civilization. British imperialism had trained these colonial troops well, German officers concluded. The Canadians learned from the best how to wage war without restraint. The defensive strategies that worked against British attacks crumbled against Canadian assault. German engineers built concrete pillboxes that withstood direct artillery hits. They positioned machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire. They flooded the ground to create impassable mud fields. None of it mattered. Canadians mapped every German position with mathematical precision, then destroyed them in carefully timed waves. They used new tactics called fire and movement that German forces had never encountered. Small teams advanced while others provided covering fire, leapfrogging forward until they stood right on top of German trenches. Intelligence reports describe weapons the Canadians favored, not rifles for clean, distant killing. They carried clubs, knives, sharpened shovels, grenades, tools for close-up butchery. One report described a Canadian officer who threw grenades with his left hand while firing a pistol with his right, moving through a German trench like death incarnate. Another described Canadians clearing a bunker in 45 seconds, every German defender inside dead before reinforcements could arrive. Oberst Friedrich Müller knew these reports by heart. He had read them during his years commanding defensive positions along the Western Front. At age 43, Müller served Germany for 2 decades, rising through ranks by following rules and maintaining discipline. He believed in order, structure, the proper conduct of war between civilized nations. Then, he met the Canadians at Vimy Ridge. April 1917, the battle that still haunted his dreams. Müller commanded a regiment holding positions that British forces failed to capture for 2 years. The ridge offered perfect defensive terrain, high ground with clear sight lines in every direction. His men occupied deep bunkers protected by barbed wire thicker than a man's arm. They had ammunition stockpiled for months of fighting. Every approach was pre-targeted by artillery. The position was impregnable. The Canadian barrage began at dawn and never stopped. Shells fell with such precision that they cut the barbed wire into segments, created paths through the defenses wide enough for assault troops. Müller watched from his command bunker as Canadian soldiers appeared through the smoke, moving in coordinated groups that flowed around German strongpoints like water around stones. His machine gunners fired until barrels glowed red. It didn't matter. More Canadians kept coming. By noon, Müller found himself surrounded in his bunker, the sounds of fighting directly overhead. A grenade bounced down the stairs, then another. Then a voice in accented German shouted for surrender. Müller emerged with hands raised, expecting a bullet. Instead, a young Canadian lieutenant who looked barely 20 years old took his pistol, checked him for other weapons, and handed him over to military police without a word. The journey to Canada took 6 weeks by ship. Müller spent the voyage packed below decks with other captured officers, hearing stories that contradicted everything German high command claimed. Some prisoners spoke of fair treatment. Others insisted these were lies designed to break their will. Müller stayed silent, watching and listening. The train north from the port city traveled for days through endless Canadian wilderness. Müller stared out windows at forests that stretched beyond sight, lakes larger than some German provinces. This land seemed built on a different scale than Europe. Everything here was bigger, emptier, colder. The Germans who colonized such country would naturally become harder, crueler. It made sense. Kapuskasing, Ontario. The name meant nothing to Müller when guards announced their arrival at the prison camp. Snow covered everything in November, piled 3 feet deep around wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. Guard towers stood at each corner, searchlights sweeping the compound. Barbed wire fences enclosed the entire facility. Müller expected the worst. German generals back home dismissed reports of humane Canadian POW treatment as obvious Allied propaganda. One memo Müller read before uncapture stated clearly, "Stormtroopers don't suddenly become gentle captors. Any claims of fair treatment serve only to encourage cowardice and surrender. Real soldiers know what awaits them in enemy hands." Müller believed these warnings as he stepped off the train into knee-deep snow. The cold bit through his uniform immediately. Temperature felt well below freezing. Guards shouted orders in English, herding prisoners toward processing buildings. This was it. The mask would drop. The brutal efficiency Canadians showed on the battlefield would transfer to how they treated captive enemies. The processing officer checked Müller's name against a roster, verified his rank, then did something unexpected. He addressed Müller as Colonel in careful German. He returned Müller's personal effects, his watch, his wedding ring, his wallet with family photographs. He explained that as an officer, Müller would receive private quarters, separate from enlisted men, exactly as the Geneva Convention required. Müller stood there in the processing room, holding his possessions, feeling the first crack in everything he thought he knew about his captors. The camp regulations appeared on a notice board in the main barracks, printed in both English and German. Müller read them 3 times, searching for the trap hidden in the words. Each prisoner would receive 3 meals, daily totaling 3,200 calories. The barracks heating system would maintain temperature at 65 degrees Fahrenheit minimum, even during the harshest winter nights. Prisoners could participate in 2 hours of recreation daily. They could run their own canteen to purchase additional goods. They could attend educational programs to learn English or trade skills. It read like fantasy. No army treated enemy prisoners this well during peacetime, let alone in the middle of the war's 4th brutal year. Müller walked through the camp during his first week, watching for signs of the real system beneath this false front. He waited for guards to drop the act once prisoners let down their guard. Camp Kapuskasing opened in 1914, just months after war began. By the time Müller arrived in late 1917, it held 1,200 German prisoners of war. The compound stretched across cleared forest land, with wooden barracks built in rows that reminded Müller of military posts back home. Each building held heating stoves that guards kept supplied with coal throughout the day. Müller tested the temperature in his quarters with a thermometer he borrowed from the camp doctor. 66 degrees. The posted minimum wasn't propaganda. The food arrived on schedule, 3 times daily. Breakfast included porridge, bread, butter, coffee. Lunch brought soup, meat, potatoes, vegetables. Dinner offered similar portions with occasional variations. Müller estimated calories by portion size and frequency. The math worked out close to the promised amount. Other prisoners who worked in the camp kitchen confirmed the supply deliveries matched what they served. What shocked Müller most wasn't the adequate food or heat. It was watching Canadian guards enforce rules protecting prisoners from abuse. During his second week, Müller witnessed a guard strike a German prisoner who moved too slowly during morning count. The incident was reported within the hour. By afternoon, that guard faced a military court-martial. The camp commandant made clear that any soldier who mistreated prisoners would receive the same harsh punishment as if they had struck a fellow Canadian soldier. The policy made no sense from a military perspective. These prisoners were enemies who killed Canadian soldiers just months earlier. Many of the guards lost friends or brothers to German bullets, yet the system demanded they treat captured Germans with strict correctness or face severe consequences themselves. The rule wasn't suggestions posted for show. The Canadians actually enforced it. By 1918, Canada operated 24 prisoner of war camps across the country. Together, they held 8,579 prisoners. Müller learned these numbers from camp administrators who tracked statistics with the same precision Canadians showed in everything else. The camps kept detailed mortality records that couldn't be faked. Death rate among prisoners stood at 0.3%. Most deaths came from the Spanish flu that swept through military and civilian populations worldwide. In comparison, German camps holding Allied prisoners reported death rates between 8 and 12%. Not every Canadian supported this approach. Müller overheard guards discussing arguments that raged in newspapers and government meetings back in Canadian cities. Military hardliners pushed for harsher treatment. They pointed to German atrocities in Belgium during the war's early days. They referenced civilians killed when German submarines sank passenger ships without warning. Public anger demanded revenge. Why should Canada feed and house enemy soldiers in comfort while Canadian boys died in French mud? The debates grew heated after each new German attack. When U-boats sank another merchant ship, Canadian newspapers called for reducing prisoner rations. When reports arrived of poor conditions in German camps, citizens demanded matching treatment for German prisoners. The pressure built constantly, pushing camp administrators to lower standards and cut costs. One man stood against the tide. Major General William Otter directed all internment operations across Canada. He was 64 years old, a veteran of multiple campaigns who understood war's brutality firsthand. He also understood something deeper about what Canada fought for. Otter sent a memo to all camp commandants that became famous among the prisoners. Müller read a translated copy posted in the barracks. The key passage stated clearly, "We defeat Germany by proving our civilization superior, not by matching their methods." Otter backed his words with action. When cost-cutting measures threatened camp budgets, he fought for funding. When public pressure demanded harsher treatment, he cited Geneva Convention requirements and refused to budge. The camps operated on tight budgets of $1.15 per prisoner per day. Otter made that limited money stretch by running efficient operations, not by starving or freezing prisoners. Christmas 1917 arrived 1 month after Müller reached Kapuskasing. He expected nothing special. Wars didn't stop for holidays. Instead, he watched Canadian commanders permit something remarkable. German prisoners could hold traditional Christmas services. Red Cross packages arrived containing food, warm clothes, letters from home. The camp even allowed prisoners to organize small musical performances. Müller attended the Christmas Eve service in the camp assembly hall. Over 300 German prisoners crowded inside, their breath visible in the cool air despite the heating stoves. A Lutheran minister who was captured at Passchendaele led prayers in German while Canadian guards stood respectfully at the back of the room. Prisoners sang traditional carols, their voices rough from emotion and months of captivity. The sound of Silent Night filled the hall, the same song that German and Allied soldiers supposedly sang together during the Christmas truce of 1914. After the service, prisoners gathered in smaller groups. Some played chess with sets carved from scrap wood. Others formed a small orchestra using donated instruments. The music wasn't professional. but it was German music played by German hands in a prison camp thousands of miles from home. Canadian guards not only permitted it, they provided the space and time for it to happen. Müller sat in the back of the hall, listening to a badly tuned violin play a melody from his childhood. The cognitive dissonance nearly broke him. These same Canadians who stormed through German trenches with such violence now allowed their captives to celebrate Christmas with dignity. The contradiction made no sense. Soldiers couldn't be savage killers and humane captors simultaneously, yet here was living proof that they could. The camp commandant made a short speech before prisoners returned to barracks. He wished everyone health and hoped the war would end soon so all could return home. He reminded prisoners that Red Cross packages would be distributed the next morning. He maintained the same firm but correct tone the Canadians used for everything. Müller walked back to his quarters through fresh snow, his boots crunching in the silence. The barracks glowed warm in the darkness, smoke rising from heating stove chimneys. Guard towers stood watch at the corners, searchlights sweeping across the white ground. It was still a prison, but it was a prison that somehow honored the humanity of its inmates while keeping them securely locked away from the war. The reality of captivity settled into routine after the initial shock wore off. Müller had witnessed enough contradictions during his first weeks to understand the Canadian approach wasn't temporary theater designed to break prisoner resistance. This was how they actually operated. The question shifted from whether the treatment was real to what it meant for everything he thought he understood about these soldiers. The work details began after prisoners completed their first month in camp. Canadian authorities offered voluntary labor in the lumber camps that surrounded Kapuskasing. Prisoners who chose to work put in 8-hour days, the same length as regular civilian shifts. The work was hard physical labor, cutting and hauling timber in the frozen Canadian wilderness, but it followed strict regulations. Müller watched guards enforce mandatory rest breaks. They ensured prisoners had proper winter clothing before sending them into the forest. They rotated workers to prevent exhaustion. The wages shocked Müller more than anything else. Every prisoner who worked received 25 cents per day. Real money, not camp script that held no value outside the wire. The Canadians paid enemy prisoners actual wages for their labor. Müller did the math. A prisoner who worked consistently could earn $7.50 per month. That money could purchase goods from the camp canteen, which sold chocolate, cigarettes, writing paper, books. Prisoners could buy small luxuries that made captivity more bearable. The monthly letter privilege allowed each prisoner to send correspondence home through the International Red Cross. Müller wrote to his wife in careful German, knowing Canadian censors would read every word before approving it. He struggled with what to say. How could he explain that the savage Canadians from battlefield reports now treated him better than some German officers treated their own soldiers? He settled on simple facts. The camp was clean. The food was adequate. He remained in good health. He hoped she and the children stayed safe. By the war's end in November 1918, Canada's prison camp system had processed 81,000 prisoners total. The number included German soldiers, Austrian troops, even some Turkish prisoners from other fronts. The system grew and adapted to handle massive influxes as the war ground toward its conclusion. Each camp maintained the same basic standards that Müller experienced at Kapuskasing. The Canadians proved their approach could scale from hundreds to tens of thousands without collapsing into chaos or cruelty. The repatriation medical examinations told a story that numbers alone couldn't capture. When doctors examined German prisoners before sending them home, they discovered something unprecedented. The average German prisoner of war in Canadian custody had gained 7 pounds during captivity. 7 pounds. In a war where soldiers on both sides starved and wasted away, prisoners in Canadian camps gained healthy weight. The medical reports were detailed and impossible to fake. They measured height, weight, general health condition. The data proved that Canada fed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own front-line troops. German propaganda ministries initially denied these reports when they leaked through neutral countries. The stories of humane treatment threatened military morale. If German soldiers believed they would be treated well in Canadian captivity, they might surrender more easily. The propaganda machine insisted that reports of good treatment were elaborate Allied lies designed to encourage cowardice. Newspapers in Berlin published fabricated stories of torture and starvation in Canadian camps. But the propaganda couldn't hold against reality. Too many prisoners returned home after the armistice. Too many soldiers wrote letters that Red Cross delivered. Too many neutral observers visited the camps and confirmed the conditions. The truth spread through German military ranks despite official denials. Soldiers facing Canadian units began to understand that capture didn't mean death. Canadian public opinion pulled in the opposite direction. After the passenger ship Lusitania sank to German torpedoes in 1915, killing over 1,000 civilians, Canadian newspapers demanded revenge. When reports arrived describing poor conditions in German camps holding Canadian prisoners, citizens called for matching treatment. Why should Canada spend money keeping German prisoners comfortable while Canadian boys suffered in German hands? The contrast between German and Canadian camp systems became impossible to ignore. Letters from Canadian prisoners in Germany described constant hunger. They wrote of inadequate heating during brutal winters. They reported forced labor that exceeded Geneva Convention limits, working 12 or 14-hour days in coal mines and factories. Disease spread through overcrowded barracks. Medical care was minimal. Death rates climbed steadily higher. Müller learned these details through conversations with newly arrived Canadian guards who transferred from other duties. Some had brothers or cousins held in German camps. They received letters describing conditions that made them angry enough to want revenge. Yet they still followed orders to treat German prisoners correctly. Müller watched the tension play out on their faces. The desire for payback fought against their training and discipline. Discipline won, but the struggle was visible. During a cold morning in February 1918, Müller experienced a moment that crystallized the entire paradox of his captivity. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and froze exposed skin in minutes. Müller woke before dawn to sounds of activity outside his barracks. Through the frosted window, he watched Canadian guards moving through the compound distributing extra blankets to each building. The guards worked quickly in the brutal cold, their breath steaming in the pre-dawn darkness. They checked each barracks to ensure the coal stoves remained properly stoked. They carried extra fuel to buildings that were running low. Müller heard them joking with each other, in English about the weather, their voices muffled by scarves wrapped around their faces. One guard stopped at Müller's building and called inside, asking if everyone had enough blankets. When a prisoner responded in broken English that they were fine, the guard nodded and moved on. Later that morning, guards distributed extra coffee rations to help prisoners stay warm. The coffee was real, not the grain substitute that both armies used when supply lines broke down. Müller stood in line with other prisoners, holding his tin cup, breathing in the rich smell of actual coffee beans. The scene felt surreal. Guards armed with rifles handed hot coffee to enemy soldiers, making sure everyone received equal portions. The morning sun reflected off snow so white it hurt to look at directly. Smoke rose from every barrack chimney. The cold bit at any exposed skin, but the barracks stayed warm and the prisoners stayed fed. The cognitive dissonance never fully resolved in Müller's mind. These Canadians who killed with such efficiency on the battlefield somehow maintained their humanity off it. They could be both things simultaneously without seeing any contradiction. It defied everything Müller learned about war and human nature during his military career. Unexpected consequences emerged from the Canadian approach. German officers began requesting transfers to Canadian custody when given the choice. Intelligence officers discovered that prisoners in Canadian camps volunteered information more freely than those held elsewhere. The fair treatment created a strange trust between captors and captives. German prisoners didn't feel the same fierce loyalty to protect military secrets when Canadians asked questions. They knew Canadians weren't going to torture answers out of them anyway, so resistance felt pointless. The full scale of the Canadian system revealed careful planning and execution. 24 camps operated simultaneously across the country, each averaging 357 prisoners. Educational programs enrolled 2,400 prisoners, learning English or trade skills that would help them find work after the war. The escape rate stayed remarkably low, and the few who tried to escape were always recaptured without being killed. Guards returned escaped prisoners to camp, added time to their sentence, and continued treating them according to Geneva Convention standards. Müller wrote another letter home in the spring of 1918, after 6 months in captivity. This time, he didn't hold back. The censors would read it anyway, and he no longer cared. He wrote that the Canadians who stormed German trenches with such ferocity now treated him with such correctness that he felt ashamed of conditions in German camps. He wrote that he spent every day confronting the gap between what he was taught about enemies and what he experienced in their hands. He wrote that when the war finally ended, Germany needed to learn from this lesson about maintaining humanity even toward those you fight against. The letter made it through censors and reached his wife 4 months later. By then, the war was stumbling toward its final bloody conclusion. The armistice came on November 11, 1918, at 11 in the morning. Müller heard the news in the camp assembly hall where prisoners gathered 3 times daily for count. The commandant made a short announcement. The war was over. Repatriation would begin within weeks. Prisoners would return home in an orderly fashion, processed through the same system that tracked their arrival. For the first time in months, complete silence filled the hall. Then someone began singing the German national anthem. Others joined until 300 voices echoed off the wooden walls. Müller sailed for Germany 6 weeks later, carrying a journal he kept throughout his captivity. The notebook contained detailed observations about Canadian camp operations. He recorded the precise calorie counts, the heating standards, the work hour limits, the wage rates. He documented the medical care, the educational programs, the recreation time. He copied regulations word for word from posted notices. He noted dates, names, specific incidents that demonstrated how the system functioned in practice. The journal wasn't meant for publication. Müller wrote it as evidence for himself, proof that what he experienced was real and not some fever dream born from trauma. But as his ship crossed the Atlantic toward a Germany he barely recognized anymore, Müller realized the journal held value beyond personal memory. It documented an approach to warfare that Germany desperately needed to understand. Post-war Germany was chaos. The Kaiser had abdicated. The military command structure collapsed. Revolution threatened from multiple directions. Food shortages starved civilians while demobilized soldiers flooded back from the fronts. In that chaos, Müller found audiences hungry for any knowledge that might help rebuild. He testified before military reform committees examining what went wrong during the war. He spoke to officer training academies about lessons learned from 4 years of industrial slaughter. When Müller described Canadian prison camp conditions, many listeners assumed he was exaggerating or suffering from some form of captivity-induced delusion. The idea that stormtroopers who killed with such efficiency would then treat prisoners humanely seemed impossible. But Müller had his journal. He had precise numbers, specific policies, documented dates. He had letters other prisoners wrote that confirmed his account. Slowly, reluctantly, German military leadership began to accept that maybe the Canadians understood something about warfare that Germany had missed. The testimony influenced post-war reforms in ways both subtle and profound. New regulations governing prisoner treatment appeared in German military codes. Officer training programs added sections on Geneva Convention requirements. The reforms didn't transform German military culture overnight, but they planted seeds that would grow slowly over the coming decades. Müller's journal became required reading in some military academies, used as an example of how maintaining ethical standards didn't require weakness. Meanwhile, Canadian prisoner of war protocols became the model for other Commonwealth nations. Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa all studied the Canadian system when developing their own approaches. The Canadians proved that humane treatment could be implemented on large scale without breaking the budget or compromising security. Other nations copied the basic framework, adapting it to their own circumstances while maintaining the core principles. The true test came 2 decades later when the world stumbled into another war. In 1939, as Hitler's Germany invaded Poland, many feared the coming conflict would abandon all pretense of civilized conduct. The First War's horrors were supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, humanity prepared for something even worse. Yet Canada again chose to maintain its standards. During World War II, Canada operated prison camps holding 35,000 German prisoners of war. The camps followed the same basic protocols Müller experienced at Kapuskesching. 3 meals daily with adequate calories, heated barracks maintaining minimum temperatures, 8-hour workdays with fair wages, educational programs, recreation time, Red Cross package distribution. The system scaled up to handle more prisoners while maintaining the core approach. The mortality rates told the story. German prisoners in Canadian camps during World War II experienced death rates comparable to the First War, around 0.3% excluding deaths from natural causes unrelated to camp conditions. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, millions of Soviet prisoners died in German camps from deliberate starvation and exposure. The contrast between different approaches to prisoner treatment couldn't be starker. Müller watched these developments from Germany, now an old man in his 60s. He spent the years between the wars advocating for international prisoner of war standards. When the League of Nations convened conferences to revise the Geneva Convention, Müller testified as an expert witness. The 1929 Geneva Convention revision incorporated many protections that mirrored Canadian practices from the First War. Daily calorie minimums, heating standards, work hour limits, recreation requirements, educational opportunities. The delegates who drafted those revisions drew from multiple sources and experiences. But Müller's detailed testimony about Canadian camps provided concrete examples of how such standards could work in practice. He wasn't the only voice arguing for humane treatment, but he was one of the few who could speak from direct experience about a system that actually implemented these ideals on a large scale during active warfare. Müller died in 1952 at age 78. His obituaries mentioned his military service, his captivity, his post-war advocacy work. His memoirs, published the year before his death, credited the Canadian prison camp experience with fundamentally changing how he understood the relationship between military effectiveness and ethical conduct. He wrote that learning warfare's brutality didn't require abandoning humanity. The Canadians proved that the same soldiers could be fierce warriors and honorable captors without contradiction. Modern military ethics training still references World War I Canadian prisoner of war camps as a case study. Officer candidates at military academies around the world study the system as an example of maintaining civilization's values under extreme pressure. The Geneva Convention protections that modern soldiers take for granted didn't emerge naturally from human goodness. They were actively chosen by nations like Canada when revenge would have been easier and popular anger demanded harsher treatment. The historical lesson cuts deeper than simple rules about feeding prisoners or heating barracks. It speaks to fundamental questions about what nations fight for and who they choose to be under pressure. Canada faced the same temptations every nation experiences during wartime: the desire for revenge, the pressure to cut costs, the argument that enemies don't deserve decent treatment. Every military in history has heard these arguments. Most have given in to them. Canada chose differently, not because Canadians were naturally better people, but because they understood something crucial about the nature of the conflict. They recognized that World War I wasn't just about defeating Germany militarily. It was about proving that democratic societies built on individual rights and human dignity were worth defending in the first place. If Canada abandoned those principles to defeat an enemy, then what exactly was the victory worth? The same men who fought with such determination at Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele could show equal determination in upholding human dignity because they understood the two weren't separate goals. They were the same goal approached from different angles. Battlefield effectiveness and ethical conduct reinforced each other rather than competing. Soldiers who knew their nation would treat them honorably if captured fought harder. Prisoners who experienced fair treatment had less reason to resist or cause problems in captivity. The true measure of a nation's character emerges not in how it treats enemies on the battlefield, but in how it treats those enemies once they've surrendered and pose no further threat. That's when the choice becomes purely about values rather than military necessity. The German generals who feared Canadian savagery learned instead that the same men who fought with such ferocity could show equal commitment to maintaining the standards that separated civilization from barbarism. Müller's journey from terrified prisoner expecting execution to advocate for international humanitarian standards embodies this lesson. He carried into captivity all the assumptions and prejudices that warfare creates. He emerged with the understanding that human beings are capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously. They can be warriors and humanitarians, fierce and gentle, brutal in battle, yet kind in victory. The contradiction isn't a flaw in human nature. It's proof of humanity's capacity to choose dignity even when circumstances would excuse cruelty. That choice, more than any battlefield victory, defines what Canada stood for during the Great War.